Thank you so much, Urata-san. It's a pleasure to be back here. The last time I was here was in March 2022. It was really nice. And even at that time, we had a lot of discussions on APEC. Also, a similar sort of brown bag webinar. Then I spoke about the developments within APEC, how we moved from the Bogo goals to the Osaka action agenda, and then to the Putrajaya vision, and the Aotearoa plan of action. So we covered a number of areas then. So today what I will try and do is two things. One is to share with you some of the findings that we obtained when we undertook a perception survey. We've done, this is the second time we've done it in the past. This is the second survey that we did last year. We covered all APEC economies except two, and we had about 7,000 respondents in total. So we try to cover as much as possible. And I think the findings are interesting. And as I walk through the findings, I'll share with you the average for APEC, and then specifically how the Japanese respondents, had to say what they had to say, their perceptions of APEC. There's some important lessons for all of us, especially policymakers, as we try and message what APEC is doing. So I will do that. And I know that earlier this morning when I was having a session with the chairman of REITI, one question was asked, yes, this is good to have the Japanese numbers, but do we have the highest? The thing we have to be cautious about in APEC is we do not do such naming and shaming or beauty contest, as it were. We will do an average and then one specific for the economy that we're talking to. So we do not do this sort of comparison just by nature of the philosophy within APEC. So I will share with you the Japanese numbers and the average for APEC. So I'm going to do this part, which is two parts, as I said. The first part is sharing with you some of the data on the perception survey, and the second part will just bring you an update of what's going on this year. So when you look at APEC as an organization, it was interesting to see that there is awareness of APEC among us APEC member economies, and we did a comparison with the Japanese, and you will see that still a lot more to be done. A little bit, if you notice there, the little bit is 50%. Folks who are aware of APEC. Yeah. Anyways, I take comfort in the fact that only 12% of the respondents said they have never heard of APEC compared with the 17% average. Now, top associations with APEC. So what do you think APEC is about? Let me just also make a correction here. For Japan, free, open, fair trade, it's 51% compared with the average. So the arrow should be pointing down. That's a small typo there. So you see that the main association, regardless of whether it's the APEC average or Japan, it's really about trade and international investment. The interconnectedness is also fairly high, but you see a fair, just energy transition is, it's fairly low for APEC as an average, but not too bad for Japan, 13%. But on supply chains, that is a bit of a concern here for when you're looking at Japan. Its resilience is 7% versus the average of 20%. So a lot of work still to be done there. On understanding of multilateralism, again, this is where Japan stands. Of concern is multilateralism, but 35% of the respondents said they've never heard of it. So clearly we have our work cut out for us. And despite the low familiarity with multilateralism, we see that the public does acknowledge that sharing and economic integration is essential for us as we are facing global challenges. So yes, again, if you look at the numbers, we've got some work to do when it comes to APEC in terms of economic integration compared with the average across APEC. The benefits of multilateralism, Japan, compared with all the indicators there, you see that the Japanese respondents thought that climate change and sustainability was still higher than free and open trade, interconnected economy, education. So clearly a lot to be focused on when it comes to work on climate change. Effectiveness of APEC in promoting multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific region. Again, much to do. There's somewhat, some folks think in Japan, 51% say you're somewhat ineffective. So if you're looking at the numbers, only about 38% think that we are either very effective or somewhat effective. So again, compared with the APEC average, we have a lot more work to do here in Japan. Digital transformation, there's so much conversation going on digital transformation in APEC, and I'm here today for the APEC Business Advisory Council meetings, and that's the private sector as a component of APEC. And there's a big chunk of work that APEC is doing on digitalization. And you see here, in the context of where Japan stands with the rest of the Asia-Pacific region, a lot more here when you think of in terms of awareness of what's going on, the impact of digital transformation. And this is, as I will explain later part of the work of the presentation, this is also another area of focus for Peru, as Peru chairs this year, using the digital transformation at the local level to help transition those in the informal sector to the formal sector. So I will touch on that a little bit more in the second part of the presentation. Here, digital transformation is seen as a driver of growth, improvement and innovation across functions and sectors. You see again, when you're looking at the APEC average versus the Japanese average, there's some level of variation there. And from the Japanese side, here's what they say about digital transformation. It has a positive impact because it facilitates economic growth, it enables enhancement of products and services, fosters innovation, creates jobs, and that's an important part of what we're doing, cost reduction, expansion of opportunities, social development. I mean, that's an interesting aspect, especially when we're looking at work that we're doing in the aging population sphere. So interesting things, perceptions from the Japanese side as well. For your own economy, how does digital transformation impact your own economy? E-commerce ranks fairly high. Then you have, but e-commerce is developing. It's interesting, these findings are interesting. Look at gig economy. Maybe it's not as prevalent here, I'm not sure, but in some economies, the gig aspect of our economies tend to stand out more. Same thing with digital trade, management of data and information. Increasingly, these aspects will come to the forefront for all of us. Beyond the trade of goods and services, the public expects trade agreements to foster best practices across economies. There are always questions about what do we really get out of trade agreements. And so that was one thing that we wanted to capture in this perception survey. Folks, of course, talk about trade in goods, but they also, interestingly, talked about responsible business conduct, standardization, important, innovation. The green digital corridor, the work that we're doing to foster greater collaboration in the digital and green economies is just gaining more and more traction, more and more prominence in the work that we're doing. Protection of international property rights. This is in the new or the more modern trade agreements. This is one very important aspect of the work that we do. When you compare with the more traditional free trade agreements, the traditional free trade agreements tend to focus more on market access, whether it's for trade or investment, whereas the newer trade agreements, such as the CPTPP and to some extent RCEP, this aspect of intellectual property enforcement and disciplines are coming to the fore. So the priorities for inclusive and sustainable growth is also a concern, something that our stakeholders want us to focus on. So for us to promote more inclusive and sustainable growth And these are important points for us as we take forward the APEC years. You will see that when we moved from the BOGO goals towards the Putrajaya vision, a lot more focus on inclusive and sustainable growth, whereas BOGO goals just focus primarily on market access. But when you look at what we put in place as our vision for APEC going forward, the inclusive and sustainable growth aspect becomes increasingly important. And I always say that today, when you talk of trade and investment, you cannot talk about it without considering inclusive and sustainable growth, because that's essentially what we're trying to achieve. So that conversation will have to take the forefront of the work that we're doing. Of course, one of the things that we expect from such interactions, such multilateral organizations, is hopefully the creation of jobs. And as we looked at the data, job creation was one of the major concerns that came through from the findings. Food security, healthcare, fighting corruption was another interesting finding for all of us. The assistance to SMEs, that's important, because if we talk of inclusive growth and do not have enough conversations on what we do with MSMEs, then we would have fallen short of our own vision. So in APEC, there's much work being done in that part of our focus for the past few years, in fact. Revitalizing this, because we did this just post-COVID, so there were still conversations around post-COVID work that we're doing. And a major stream of work that we're doing also, when you talk of inclusive growth, is the focus on gender equality and helping those marginalized or those who are made vulnerable because of climate change, for example, digitalization, displacement. So that's another aspect of work that is going on in APEC. And this year also a focus not just on gender, but also on people with disabilities. So a bit more of that when I do the second part of my presentation. So now, that was on the what do people think of APEC? What do people expect from APEC? That was the first part, just to set the scene. Now, when I'm bringing it back to what we're doing this year with Peru at the helm of APEC. So just to recap some things, in 2022, just as we were coming out of the COVID-19, Thailand as host took us through a thinking process about green growth, about the importance of sustainable development. This is a key part, like I said, with the Putrajaya vision, there are three key parts of APEC, which is trade and investment, which is your bread and butter, essentially. Then you've got digitalization and innovation, and then the third part, and that's where we're looking to see more focus on, because people are telling us this is where you should be looking at. You should be doing more work on this, the sustainability and inclusive part of APEC's work in general. A strong point for Thailand that year too was on returning to travel. And it was interesting how as the year progressed, we started with a lot of, processes and procedures to get to Thailand, to get to the meeting venues. And then that was in December when we had the first meeting. And then we went into lockdown again because of the new strain. So you saw us going back into a virtual mode and then coming out of that. So it was a very interesting time for all of us, a lot of learning in that, and a lot of managing of risk, health risk and travel risk. So it was for me, very pivotal that year when Thailand was at the helm of APEC. The kinds of learning and putting it into practice, all the things that we said about facilitating travel, facilitating movement of people, the biocircular green economy, all that thinking was put in place during the Thai year. Then fast forward to 23, last year, you had the whole aspect of again, very strong focus on inclusivity, sustainability for trade and investment. So much of that discussion was on how do we make sure that it's easy to have a slogan, no one is left behind, ensuring that no one is left behind, but how do you translate that into action? And I think in the US year, there was a lot of engagement done, stakeholder engagement that was done to make sure that the policymakers too were aware of the impact of our work on the average person. So there was much engagement, and there was what I thought was an important initiative, the APEC Multi-Stakeholder Forum, where we brought in folks from across society to San Francisco to have their voices heard. So sharing of their concerns with policymakers. It was an informal session, but very important takeaways. We had people with disabilities represented. We had indigenous peoples represented, of course, women and youth. So having those diverse voices in the room, which we don't normally do, we normally have, what we normally have in the room are the voices of the private sector, the business community. But these other voices was really enlightening for us as policymakers. And the other important thing that was done was having the small and medium enterprises ministers meet together with the trade ministers. I thought that was important. And then having small and medium enterprises representatives, business representatives, come into the ministerial and tell the ministers, here's what APEC has been doing well, here's where you need to do more. So that sort of conversations, I thought, really added value to the work that we were doing in APEC. Peru's year this year is encapsulated in this theme, empower, include, grow. And if you look at the three priorities, trade and investment for inclusive and interconnected growth, the innovation and digitalization to promote the transition to the formal economy, and sustainable growth. Essentially, if you can map these three priorities over the APEC Putrajaya vision, and then you can see how making meaning of what we're saying in the vision, translating that vision into action and reality in the way Peru is doing it. So in the trade and investment, we're having conversations on the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. Folks are saying, yeah, this is an old story, why are you going back to that? Essentially, because the nature of trade and investment has evolved. And so that important conversation, we've got so many trade agreements in place. How do we make sense? Where is the coherence across this? So the APEC Policy Support Unit is doing some work on this, and we'll be sharing some of the findings later this year. So it will then really help us to see how to make sense of these various trade agreements that we have. The traditional, the newer ones, there's so many other elements that come into a trade agreement. And, you can't just talk of market access today as we're having this discussion in APEC. You have to look at inclusive growth. You have to see how labor rights are included, how competition, whether it's in the form of state-owned enterprises, disciplines, things like that. I mean, those are important conversations. That's what we're focused on this year. And of course, the digitalization to promote the transition to the formal and global economy. What we've found is in APEC, you've got the range is significant. You have some economies that you have about 8.5% of folks in the informal sector. Then you have Peru, where you have 70+% of folks in the informal sector. So then you can understand why it is important for us to appreciate what's going on in this. If you're talking of inclusive, again, the whole idea of including people, empowering people, helping them to grow, how do you figure this out when there's a significant population in the informal sector? Why are they in the informal sector? When you know that when you're in the informal sector, you don't have access to funds, safety nets. So during COVID, the folks who were affected very strongly were those who were in the informal sector, whether they were women, whether they were informal tourist guides, those people. So what is it that's making them stay in the informal sector and reluctant to move to the formal and the formal sector. So that conversation is happening, and we are looking at having a better framework to have that important conversation to see how policymakers can make the change. And one thing that was highlighted over and over again is why should you move to the formal sector if it's so onerous, if you've got 1 million regulations, 1 million licenses, I'm exaggerating of course, to apply for before you can start your business in the formal sector? Why should you move? So the whole idea of ensuring structural reform, facilitating business, the ease of doing business, first get that right. Then you can have, the conversation about moving folks from the informal. There's more incentive then for folks to move from the informal sector to the formal sector. So that's another important stream of work that's happening this year. And of course, sustainability, we cannot avoid discussing sustainability in our work that we're doing. So linking that back to the BCG, that Thailand, the biocircular green economy work that we've done, and carrying that forward as well. And just on inclusive growth, let me just quickly mention that this year, like I said, last year, it was making sure that the SMEs are involved in the discussions on trade. So the ministers of trade and the ministers in charge of SMEs met together. This year, we had the ministers of trade meeting with the ministers in charge of women's affairs, women's economic empowerment, meet and seeing how then we can ensure that women entrepreneurs are integrated into our policies, that there's policy coherence across APEC on these matters. We have data. The WTO has just put in place an informal working group for women and trade. So those conversations, APEC can easily contribute to those conversations. So Peru's year, where are we now? We have already had a number of meetings. We had the informal meeting in December. We've had SOM 1 in February. We had SOM 2 in May. And next week, a lot of us will be heading back to Lima for SOM 3 and related meetings. Included in the ministerials this year, as I said, we've already had the women ministers meet with the trade ministers. You've had the ministers for trade themselves, the tourism ministers also meeting. And interestingly, the ministers for tourism talked of regenerative tourism and how, again, the whole idea of the informal folks in the tourism sector, how do you make them, how do you entice them or encourage them to move to the formal sector? Coming up will be a busy time for us in August and September. We're having the food security ministerial, the energy ministerial, health, and then the senior officials also in the meeting, the small and medium enterprises meeting together with the ministers. Peru, again, as host economy, you have the privilege of putting an important part of your agenda, highlighting that to the rest. And in this case, this year, Peru is highlighting the mining sector. We've had some history of work on mining. It has sunset to some extent, and Peru feels very strongly that given all the things that are happening, whether it's in the EV sector, in the sustainability sector, human rights sector, labor sector, you need to have that, because mining is important to some of our economies. So having that dialogue on mining is important, so that will happen also. Finance ministers is part of our annual dialogue, and one key aspect that finance ministers will be focusing on will be sustainability financing, of course. Yeah, and then we have the APEC Leaders Week in November. So looking forward, there's some deliverables, as I mentioned earlier, the work on the transition from the informal to the formal and global economy, a fresh look on the free trade area for the Asia Pacific. Peru has been doing a lot of work this year in schools, universities, just to bring the realization of APEC. And to some extent, the work that we've done in the perception survey also contributed to the initiatives that's being taken to bring APEC to the people. So engaging with different parts of society in APEC, not just in Peru, rather, not just the business community, but also at the local level, universities, schools, engaging with artists and academia. So we've had some fun parts of the explanation of APEC, the dance and all those cultural side. Equally important as the very informal policy discussions. So having that balance, I think Peru has brought that lovely balance to the table this year. So it's not just the tried and maybe for some of us not so exciting work on trade and investment, although I find trade and investment very exciting. Some people not necessarily so. But having another layer of engaging civil society, schools, artists in this whole APEC journey has been very interesting, is very interesting for us this year. So that's my presentation.